Hey everyone, it's Deeg, back today talking about Planetside 2, sharing my thoughts on the Planetside 2 new player experience. This topic has ignited a new interest in the community because of RPG's promise to focus its next large update on this problem of the new player experience in Planetside 2. And I've given this some thought. I've examined my feelings about this problem. I've tried to get a couple handfuls of friends into Planetside to appreciate it, to understand it, to see it for what it is. And I think in doing this, I've settled on some key concepts to explain to my friends what Planetside 2 actually is. And those words are PvP, social, sandbox. Let's talk about what a sandbox is. Sandbox is a term you'll hear most frequently when talking about games that are designed in one of two ways. It's kind of two opposites on a spectrum. On the one side, you have sandbox type games like Planetside. These are games that usually place a high premium on player agency, on player storytelling, and rely on the players to create the game on the fly as they go. On the other side, you have theme park type games. A theme park type game sacrifices a lot of player agency in order to get a more curated moment to moment experience within the game. Rather than trust players to make their own fun, the game takes that trust away and says, here's the fun you're going to have. And rather than trusting in yourself and your friends and your enemies to make the experience you want, you trust in the game to provide you with that experience. MMOs are the most common place where you'll see these two sides of the coin being examined. Is this more of a sandbox type MMO? Is this more of a theme park type MMO? Most modern MMOs are quite theme park. They hold your hand. They're very clear about how to find the fun. They're full of UI indicators, GPS features. They let you click a button to find a group. They force you to do a minimum amount of socialization, thinking, and planning and consideration in order to get in and find the most enjoyable moments in the game. This is done with I think, primarily sympathetic heart on behalf of developers to say we want to make sure as many players as possible can find the fun that we think we've built into our game. Sandbox, on the other hand, a sandbox type style game, is a place where you're more likely to find emergent gameplay. Perhaps you've seen these fantastic, breathless articles written about EVE Online in the past, as I have. These are articles describing the incredible machinations of people within the EVE community to support and screw with each other. The massive scale of gain and loss, alliances made and broken, the human drama. This is all player created content. In EVE Online, which is a much more sandbox style game. However, if you've done like what I have and you've tried to get your hands on this game, what you'll probably have noticed is that it's not that fun. It's kind of hard to find the fun in EVE Online unless you're one of these people who's willing to put in the effort to make the fun. And a large amount of that in a PvP game like EVE Online and like Planetside 2 is reliant on your interest and ability to make connections with allies and enemies and have that be a source of enjoyment. So sandbox games gain the ability to have emergent gameplay and player-centered storytelling and they sacrifice accessibility, the ability for everyone to get in and have an enjoyable experience. That last point speaks directly to Planetside 2 and its new player experience. What makes it so good is that Planetside 2 has a deep and interesting and fun and varied sandbox of ways to play the game. You can get into a plane, get into a tank, get a light machine gun, go nuts, hop into a mech suit. You can go dog fighting. You can hop in a bomber. You can hop into a dune buggy and go flying over hills while harassing slow-moving tanks. The ability for this game to produce interesting asymmetrical moments is huge. And it's a strength of any kind of sandbox game to do exactly this kind of thing. So what else does a sandbox game sacrifice? Well, upon considering this, I think one of the most important things for Planetside 2 and its new player experience that I've settled on is the question of how do players win? In most non-sandbox games, in most theme park style games, one of the things that makes these games so accessible and so broadly appealing is the access to the win condition. In order to have access to a win condition, you have to understand the win condition. Kill the monster, defuse the bomb, slay the dragon, capture the booty, whatever it ends up being. In a more sandbox style game, win conditions are typically left pretty vague in order to let the players define their own win condition. Again, this has strengths. In many ways, this discussion is not about Planetside strengths because we're talking about the new player experience. And I'll explain why. I'm preaching to the choir here. If you're watching this video, there's a very high probability you already know and love Planetside 2. And I hope y'all will understand what I understand, which is that ultimately, what we think will improve the game might not line up very well with what the game needs to grow. Planetside 2, for the last few years, has been hovering somewhere between, I think it's fair to say it's somewhere around a few thousand active players every single day. Average active players. Depending on where you go to Steam charts or where you get your information, I think Fisu has the best information. And I had the privilege of interviewing Rel, the lead designer, last year. And one of the things that I really read from him as being deep within his heart when it comes to his approach to shepherding along the game of Planetside 2 is what he wants is an increase in players engaging with the game every single day over time. More players. He wants more Planet Men. Who doesn't want more Planet Men? I want more Planet Men. But we have to ask ourselves, what costs are we willing to pay to find more Planet Men? Because there may be a cost involved. Okay, let's go back to talking about winning. Win conditions. I think win conditions are actually incredibly important. And I want to look at 3 categories of games as examples of what win conditions do for a PvP multiplayer shooter game. Let's talk about them one by one. Here's the first question. What is a win? Overwatch. It means pushing the cart to the end of the road. Very clear. How do you do that? You stand next to it. In Apex, be the last man standing. In Quake, outfrag your enemy. These are elemental, easy to understand win conditions. And the way that you can be an agent in the success of those conditions is not that hard to understand. Because these win conditions are clearly defined, it's also easier to understand when an exciting moment occurs. What's an exciting moment? It's when an individual does something that has a big effect on the potential of a win. Overwatch, a team wipe, denying a critical ultimate ability, outflanking a support and catching them off guard. These are all big moments. They get people really excited in these games. How about Apex? Apex is the game I know the least about, but I'm going to float some out here that sound right. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong. Controlling an area with that's tactically advantageous or has access to resources that are good. Reviving your friends. Those are big moments to get a revive off. Scavenging quality equipment. Very exciting to find the best quality equipment on the map. And let's talk about Quake. When you deny access to power-ups like the big armor or the mega health. Huge. Getting a big stack, rolling around the map with 200 health, 200 armor, while your enemy is respawning with less than half of each. People get excited because they know it's time for one player to get aggressive and for one player to run. It creates an immediate narrative moment that we can understand. And of course, in Quake, there's the sheer expedient of out-aiming. Hitting a crazy-ass railgun shot, hitting a mid-air rocket, having a laser-guided lightning gun. Those are all huge, easy to understand, legible moments that work towards the win condition of out-fragging your enemy. So not only does a good win condition create for big moments, but it also paves the path for progress. Because if you have a win condition that is understood and that everyone agrees on, then progress can also be understood as an ability to achieve the win condition more frequently over time. In all three of these games, there are ranked matches and a skill-based matchmaking queue you can enter in, and your rank goes up as you improve. I'm not going to examine skill-based matchmaking. It's got its problems. But roughly speaking, it approximates a individual progression in competence that is something that is completely opaque in other types of games. Now, this is about the new player experience. So the last thing that I have here about a benefit for a clear win condition is that when a win condition is clearly defined, new players know how to orient themselves. If you're playing Overwatch, your job is to learn the maps, pick a role and learn that role. If you're playing Apex, learn the map, pick a role, learn it. Very similar. And learn the equipment and power-ups. Quake, learn the maps, practice timing. Timing being when the power-ups come up on the map. And be able to, in your head, predict where the enemy is as a result. Also, aim. Applies to all these games. Now let's take these ideas and apply them to Planetside. The Sandbox of Planetside 2. What does winning mean? Well, the clearest win condition that's accessible to all players are alerts. Alerts are events that get kicked off based on the parameters of the continent you're playing on, with up to 1,200 people on it. And it involves your faction capturing the most territory within a given time limit. When the alert's over, the continent flips your color, and you have to leave. Everyone gets a payout of some amount of certification points, which is the universal currency used for unlocking equipment. This can be pretty exciting the first couple times. But there's a moment that occurs after the alert where what you're rewarded with is starting a new fight on a new continent. And something about that experience feels a bit like a punishment a lot of the time. You're going from a moment when the game is exciting, people are playing for territory, they're throwing their bodies on the points, to a moment where new fights are getting going and everything slows all the way down. The action goes from a 100 to a 0. And for most veteran players, the payouts on these alerts are not that important. They're not that important. So because the alert slows down the action, and because the payouts for the alert win are not that interesting, alerts as a win condition, I think, don't quite do it for the average player. And if they don't quite do it for the average player, there's no way in hell they're going to do it for the new player. I think alert wins, in addition to being a bit of a letdown to the average Planetside player, the you and me, the choir, people who are logging in, watching content. Think about the new player. When an alert happens, what do? They can't respawn. They have to go to another continent. What a confusing moment that must be. And I know people listening to this might be thinking to themselves, but Deeg, Planetide's a social game. You should be playing with a platoon, and that platoon leader should be directing you. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. That's true. But I'm not talking about how you should play Planetside. I'm talking about how the average new player plays Planetside. Most people who would play a game like this don't want to be in a social experience all the time. Most people who play PvP online shooters aren't doing it for that. And as much as I love the platoon experience in Planetside 2, to me it doesn't hold a candle to the small squad experience. That's where most of the fun is. And a small squad doesn't have the ability to move the map. So anyway, I don't want to get too deep into critiquing alerts, but I think I can sum up my feelings about it to say they're not a high quality win condition for a PvP multiplayer shooter. Okay, next question. Exciting moments. Exciting moments can happen in Planetside too, but they're not the same. Having a big C4 go off that clears out a point that then gets just recaptured by the enemy 10 seconds later ain't the same as denying an ultimate that allows your team to push forward the objective. It's not the same as denying a power up in Quake. Because the win condition is not robust, and because there are so many people on the map, those small moments that can happen, they matter a lot less. You know, I think back to a great clip from one of the outfit wars that went past, where Commander Sirius is doing commentary over the actual map, and Recursion is playing. I can't remember who they're playing against. But the cool moment that happens is while Sirius is flying over one of the points, a harasser jumps onto the top of the building and then road kills a whole half a squad of Recursion dudes. And it's just a cool looking moment. It's a rule of cool moment. Like, damn, that was cool. But it didn't matter. Like, it didn't have any effect on the match at all. Really, really. And because there are so many ways and so much fuzz and RNG in the massive size of the sandbox, big moments are hard to share and hard to get excited about sometimes. It all goes back to the win condition, in my opinion. What else? Progress. The only progress in Planetside is individual progress. Is my aim improving? Am I unlocking weapons? Stuff like that. Your ability to affect the map is not terrifically closely related to your competence as an individual player. If you're playing with a platoon, then most often your ability to move the map is based on how many players you're playing with. How many dudes did you bring? And less so than in any marker of individual agency in aggregate. So again, that player promise is not that interesting. The person who has the most friends wins. Oh boy, that's exciting. And then the last point about the win conditions is how players orient themselves. And this is what we're engaged with right now. How should a new player in Planetside 2 orient themselves? So in this conversation, I've seen a lot of suggestions about honestly good ideas of how to make Planetside 2 more approachable for new players. Like ideas for simple and effective tutorials, ideas for um, social features that are outstanding and would be useful. Ideas for things like equipment loadouts. I think Shocker did a really good video talking about this. I agree with everything he said. Those would be a great improvement. But who are those improvements for, really? All the friends I have who've tried this game would not have stuck around if all those things were in the game today. It's those friends that I'm thinking of when I'm talking about this. And when I'm going to, and they're the ones who I have in mind when I suggest what I'm about to suggest. So let's break it down. Planetside 2 is a sandbox game that has unclear win conditions, which is part of the sandbox formula and strength. And all in all, I think it's fair to say that Planetside 2 is a niche game with niche appeal. This is the way I present it to everyone who asks me about it. It's not for everyone. But let's be more specific about that. What is it that makes it niche? Well, I'm thinking of three kinds of niche properties here. One of those properties is a 100% PvP game. Straight up, that's going to screen out a lot of possible gamers that don't want to have an experience where they're playing against another person. They want something more relaxed, more paced, easier. So that's property one, PvP. Property two, sandbox games. We've been talking about this for the last 15 minutes, so you know what I'm talking about here. But generally speaking, the way the industry is going in gaming and on mobile and on console and everywhere else is that theme park type experiences are vastly more favored and more financially rewarded than sandbox type experiences. Lastly, and this is a bit of a weaker part of the argument, but I think it's technically true, is it's a PC game. Yes, I know Planetside exists on PlayStation, but I think it's fair to say that it's not as culturally relevant as we all would hope it would be. So Planetside combines three niche properties of being a PC primarily PvP sandbox game. It's a niche of a niche of a niche when it comes to multiplayer shooter games. My hypothesis is that if you're going to really hit the new player experience problem at the roots and plant the right seeds to grow a new player experience that players who never would have given Planetside a shot before will change their mind, we need to hit these three properties and broaden at least one of them. So, the problem of PCs, PC only. There are a lot of games I've seen. Like I've been astonished in the last few years. My boomer brain just completely gets blown when I see that like Call of Duty is on mobile. Um, I don't think that's something the Planetside 2 could ever do. So we're going to check out that possibility. Planetside 2 is going to be a mainly PC game for the indefinite future. PvP. This niche property is another one that I don't think we can possibly see change for Planetside. The ability to have NPCs with scripted behaviors that move and shoot is a tremendous amount of work that requires a baseline engine function that I don't think is available for Planetside 2. And there's no reason for us to expect that it will be anytime soon. RPG? Prove me wrong. But the possibility of Planetside 2 evolving into a more Destiny-like game where there are things like raids and things like open world events and things like I don't know, whatever else that game does, I think is pretty close to impossible. The last niche property that I think we actually can successfully attack is the sandbox one. So how do we attack the sandbox to broaden the appeal of Planetside 2? I've got two vectors here that I'm going to propose. And I think that if you think about evolving the Planetside formula in these two ways and combining them, you can get some interesting futures that open up doors for players who previously would pass on Planetside 2. And those two ways are the map and the equipment. Let me explain. Let me explain. Maps first. Um, this is going to be a simple argument. Planetside maps are too fucking big for new players. I love them. I love the sense of a huge world. But it is completely overwhelming for a new player to approach Indar, Esamir, Amarish. It is the first thing that overwhelms Planetside players when they start the game. They pull up the map and they see, and they go to Indar and they see it has 89 bases. But only a handful of them ever actually have fights. Which then paves the way to, well, how do we get to the base? And then we need things like redeploy and instant action to make sure new players have a good enough experience. And with all the problems that things like redeploy and instant action open up, which is not the purview of this video. I think that redeploy and instant action are, if you look at what I'm about to propose, redeploy and instant action starts to jump out at me as something of a design crutch to mitigate the harshness of the sandbox by dealing with its outcomes rather than hitting it at its core. Big maps make for big fights. This is like the thing that Planetside makes headlines for, right? 1,200 players on the map. Oh my god, biggest FPS fight ever. But here's the problem. Big fights aren't fun. Man, I wish I was wrong about that. Big fights in Planetside aren't fun. The larger a fight gets, the more RNG completely fuzzes and overpowers the efforts of any individual player in that fight. Not to mention the technical problems that many players, kind of poses. Planetside 2 is in some senses a real technical marvel. The ability to put 100 players all with interpolated animations on the screen where you can shoot in a general direction of a player and expect your bullet to largely go where it looks like it's going to is, I think, a bigger achievement than most people give credit. However, even if the technical problems and performance issues of having a big fight were completely mitigated, it wouldn't solve the big fight problem at its core. Again, the bigger a fight gets, the less agency an individual player has. This is exacerbated by Planetside's domain equivalency. Infantry, air, and ground. They all have their own power. None of them is technically subservient to the others, except you could argue air and vehicle being subservient to infantry, mainly because the way bases are designed in Planetside 2, infantry capture the vast majority of them. However, when it comes to winning fights, to living and dying, there's no superiority there. No one domain has the upper hand. And I know people are going to disagree with this. And if you do, fine, great. But let's move along. The last thing about big fights that I want to say, and this is something that I learned from our good friend Lex, who I interviewed a little bit ago. And Lex, you can correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly. But one of the things that really opened my minds up about why big fights in Planetside don't feel fun is that Planetside's gunplay, things like the refire rates, the bullet travel speed, magazine size, the damage fall off, all these things was designed based on an existing game that some of y'all may have heard of. It's called Battlefield Bad Company. a game a lot of people like. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you look up Battlefield Bad Company, one of the things you'll notice is that the max server size for that game is 24 players. And if you've ever been in a 24-person fight in Planetside 2, you might start to recognize that that's where the infantry gunplay feels the most fun. At least that's what I've begun to feel. This is a place where I'd love to have a real high-quality debate with the community if there is one to be had. I don't think this is something that's really been discussed that much. By the way, Lex, make a video about this, man. I think you should still do it. So, Planetside maps are too big. They create big fights. They require design experience like redeploy and instant action. And they're overwhelming to new players. When attacking the sandbox, we should think about shrinking the map, shrinking player caps, and shrinking the fights. So the other vector is equipment. I think this is an easy argument to make too. Planetside has too much equipment for new players. There was maybe a manageable amount when the game came out back in 2012, but it's 2021. It's been almost 9 years. And the amount of equipment available is an incredible boon to the game. The number of ways to play the game, the number of things you can unlock, and tools and toys to play with. Again, in a sandbox, it's great. But if you're a new player, you can't deal with the whole world at once. And for a new player, this is what commonly happens in my experience. Many choices of equipment begets a perception of many wrong choices. You know what I'm talking about, right? One of the first things a new player will ask is, which gun is an upgrade? That's the most obvious way to compare gear, is what is strictly better, what is strictly worse. We all know that there is no gear that is, generally speaking, a strict upgrade. Unless we're talking about, multiple tiers of the same implant or suit slot or thing like that. But the game is designed at its core with the progression of equipment being horizontal. A Planet Man with all the gear unlocked isn't necessarily more powerful in any given moment than a player with a quarter of the gear unlocked. But what they are is much more mobile and effective in a variety of situations. I think that design principle is a boon to Planetside. But when you're a new player engaging with the massive quantity of equipment, the thing that I think a lot of us don't understand, who can look at the equipment and see anti-air, say, oh, this is what I pull when I need to deal with max units. This is what I pull when there's mosquitoes camping the spawn rooms. This is what I pull when the infantry gods show up and I don't want to pull my hair out trying to hit them with headshots, right? We see that. We're humans. We live in a universe of meaning. If we see a hammer, we don't see a stick with a hunk of metal attached to it. We see something for driving in nails or other things. So too, we see the same thing when we look at the Planetside equipment list. But if you're a new player and you don't understand the game, all you see is mystery. All you see is misunderstanding. New players wield equipment they don't understand to die to equipment that they don't understand. The worst offenses occur when players are surprised by enemy players who are using equipment from the other domains that they're not equipped to fight. If you show up ready to have an infantry fight on the point and you get camped air to ground, boy, that's a bad moment. Afflick, if you're watching this, I know you'd agree with this. If you're playing in a tank and you're trying to have a great time just going around the edges of fights, trying to find pop sunderers, doing your vehicle versus vehicle thing, and a fucking Bastion shows up, good luck. Good luck. How about orbital strikes? I'm not sure what domain they fit into. But we can all think of 1,000 different examples of this problem, where domain overlap exacerbates issues that new players face. yes, these things can be softened somewhat by some of the ideas that are out there in the community. By controlling what equipment a new player has more effectively, we can grant community favorite equipment, like making sure everyone gets nano weave who's playing infantry. Um, we can even give players fully upgraded static loadouts. This is something that Schocter suggested. I think it's a good suggestion. Other games like this do exactly that. These are good ideas, but they don't solve the problem of what other players are using, which is the main problem that new players face. Just like we shrunk the maps, my proposal here for new players is that in order to enjoy Planetside, the best thing that they could have happen is for us to shrink the equipment not only that the new player is using so they can focus, but to shrink the equipment that their allies and their enemies are using. So now let's combine these two ideas. Planetside, I want to call it 2.0, but it's already Planetside 2, called Planetside 3.0. Planetside 3.0. We combine the idea of smaller maps and restricted equipment to open up more defined win conditions. What could this look like? At this point, my hope is that your imaginations are running wild. There is no right answer to this. To me, this is all about intent and direction. But here's a few things that I brainstormed before we sat down today. Number one, naval warfare. How about a map where the objective is to fly aerial vehicles to destroy enemy carriers, which act as warp gates? The map is entirely water. So ground vehicles, fuck off. Make it, let's say, half a platoon for each faction. 24v24v24 at max. So that's maximum 72 players on the board. That's right. And all you can do is fly ESFs, Galaxies, and maybe Liberators. I'm not so sure about Libs. And the goal is to destroy the enemy carrier and there's a bunch of dog fighting and beautiful air versus air fighting. This is the thing that we all want to have happen when we're flying air vehicles. I think that for a new player, the fantasy of getting into a fighter doesn't really involve a lot of air-to-ground farming. It involves dog fighting. And this would be a cool way to apply it to give players a concrete fantasy. And a concrete win condition. Destroy the carrier. By shrinking down the number of players on the map, making a clear win condition, and restricting the equipment, players know what they're getting whenever they go to this map. Another example. This is probably my favorite one. And this is probably coming out of my Team Fortress Classic experience. Dune buggies. Oh god, I so want this. Dune buggies, Planetside 2. The objective is to capture the LLU. If you don't know what an LLU is, it's an idea from Planetside 1. Planetside 1 had capture the flag bases. Rather than having a timer that you needed to wait out to capture a base in Planetside 1, these bases actually spawned a ball, like a little Pokeball. An infantry player could pick up the Pokeball, and you had to get it to a linked base that your faction controlled. And if you did that, you won. And of course, there's a big distance between the bases. So what do is you hop into a ground vehicle, and someone drives you over, and you get these amazing moments where you're in this vehicle and you're out trying to outrun all these planes, and people are chasing you and pulling tanks and trying to catch up to you, the LLU carrier, and you're frantically dodging fire, and you have friends from your base driving up to support you and distract, and it creates these super fun moments. And what if we had capture the flag in Planetside 2? And what if we did it with harassers? And what if we did it on a map with rolling sand dunes between two bases and had 12 players on a side, 12v12? Hell yeah, that would be fun. Don't tell me it wouldn't be. You can restrict things like infantry AV or whatever. I don't know. Again, this is all applying the idea of smaller maps, restricted equipment. And I'm not partial to which application of this is best. I'm hoping y'all will make some suggestions. A few more I have written down here. Tankland. Just give a tank playground, man. Have a map where all the capture points are vehicle capture points. All you can pull are ground vehicles. Infantry, AV, not allowed. Air vehicles, not allowed. Easy. Another idea. Storm the beach. This is a classic from old school arena shooters. And also, it's kind of what you see with Overwatch, I guess. An asymmetrical team versus team mode. One team attacks, other team defends. Capture a mountain fortress is what I've written down. It's generic, right? But you know what I'm talking about. Again, 12v12, allow infantry and maxes, no air vehicles. I hope by now that the strength of these win conditions is starting to jump out at you guys is kind of exciting. These win conditions are are promises that the game is making to players who engage with it that can drum up interest in a way that I think Planetside 2 Sandbox never can. Destroying enemy carriers, capturing the flags and harassers, an all-out tank battle, an asymmetrical attack defend. You could also do an implementation of 6v6 infantry, of course. That's a well-trodden idea, and I'm sure the community has lots of other things that they could throw out there. If we're being modest, and we're going for a design that is closer to what we've already seen, we can even have an idea of Lil Araxis. What is Lil Araxis? Well, picture like a desolation-sized continent designed for 150 players. A platoon on each faction. And a set of rotating mutators, which is borrowing a term from Unreal Tournament, that vary the kind of equipment that's allowed on this continent. Let's say Thursdays is Tank Battle Thursdays. Something like that. So every single Thursday, this continent of 150 players is going to be an all-out tank battle. Just go have fun. Go nuts. The particulars don't particularly matter. And to be honest with y'all, for what I personally want, I don't need this from Planetside 2. And that should be evident because I already play the game and I make content about it. I don't need this to enjoy Planetside 2. In fact, it could diminish my enjoyment of it to have more theme parky type modes. But remember, we're here to answer the question of how to improve the new player experience. And my sense is that players who choose not to engage with Planetside 2 aren't making that choice because they're stupid, but they're making that choice because they're smart. And they see the game, and they understand what it means to them, and they're good. To get those people, you can't attack them at the level of tutorials. Education will not convert those players. What would attract those players is a change to the basic promises of what Planetside is. And that is the soul of my, I guess, theory here. I really love all the smaller stuff that can be done to help new players better enjoy Planetside 2. And I think these things should absolutely happen. Absolutely. The community's been going nuts with ideas lately. And there are so many good ones out there. And I'm sure a few of them are going to get into the game and it's going to make things better. I'm not saying don't do these things. I'm only saying that ain't the big bite at the problem. The big bite at the problem is to add on to the formula for Planetside 2. You know, my guiding watchword sentiment for this discussion is that my greatest wish for Planetside 2 is that the Sandbox was just one way to play the game. One of several, one of many. I had this vision sometime in the last year, I think. I first got this idea about the tragedy of Planetside Arena. And of course, that's its own story. We won't tell it here today. But Planetside Arena used the Planetside IP to create a lobby shooter with big scale fights. And I kept thinking to myself, what an interesting world it would be if Planetside Arena and Planetside 2 were the same game with connective tissue, with linked progression. And when you log into Planetside, you can either choose to drop on Indar and go to the Crown, or choose to jump into a massive clash. Is that what the mode was for Planetside Arena? Drop into a Royale match. Whatever. Have all these be ways of experiencing the Planetside 2 IP, connecting with that community. That's the kind of vision, the only vision of Planetside that I can see that would actually hit the new player problem at its base, new player experience problem at its base. It's all about what makes people stay. And maybe you can prevent people from rage quitting in their first hours. But there's a difference between not rage quitting and choosing to stay. There is so much competition out there for players' interest. We could compete harder. Again, I think that the vectors to attack this problem are: we need new continents that are smaller for players to play on. We need the ability to restrict access to equipment in some way that is predictable and understood. And we need clear win conditions. Combine all three of those. And that's a vision for Planetside that I think that could be very dangerous and very interesting, and actually doing what Rel wants, just bringing people to the game. Okay. That is the talk. That's the idea. I'm really glad to have gotten this out of my head. What do y'all think?